Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Rausan Pereira. Russian President Vladimir Putin warned on Sunday that further Western attacks on Syria would bring chaos to world affairs as Washington prepared to increase pressure on Russia with new economic sanctions. In a telephone conversation with his Iranian counterpart Hassan Rouhani, Putin and Rouhani agreed that the Western strikes had damaged the chances of achieving a political resolution in the 7-year Syrian conflict. On Saturday, the United States, France and Britain launched 105 missiles targeting what the Pentagon said were 3 chemical weapons facilities in Syria in retaliation for a suspected poison gas attack in Douma on April 7th. The Western countries blame Assad for the Douma attack that killed dozens of people. The Syrian government and its ally Russia have denied involvement in any such attack. The bombings mark the biggest intervention by Western countries against Assad and ally Russia. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the situation in Syria and what it means for the world. Joining me on the program today are Pramit Chaudhuri, Foreign Affairs Editor, Hindustan Times; Anil Trigunayat, former Ambassador; Professor Pant, Head Strategic Studies Observer Research Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you. First, let's talk about where is Syria headed after the missile strikes by the Allied forces?
Well, in fact, as you can see that in Syria, it is virtually the business as usual. They have condemned as usual, like the Russians also did. But unfortunately, the political dialogue by itself has definitely been sent back by a wide margin. The problem with the whole thing is that while they were discussing, they have sent the OPCW inspectors to go and see whether there was actually the chemical attack or not, the veracity of it. At the same time, the Americans and the British and the French decide to bomb 3 facilities. That is very suspect in that sense because it does not achieve any objective. Besides, Russia was definitely informed before, as the French president had said, and the American president also had said the missiles are coming and all that. So that gave them adequate time to look after themselves. In such situations, because this reminds you of the previous such incidents. I mean, it has happened in the case of Iraq, it has happened in the case of Libya and some other places, wherever their external interventions are virtually imposed. That does not serve the rule of the international law. Now, on the one hand, they are saying that this was done to enforce the international law because, of course, it's a deplorable thing if the Syrians have indeed used the chemical, have indulged in chemical attack. That should not have been the case. They should be then the whole might of the international community should come against them, but through the United Nations, not through these kind of interventions that serve no purpose. So I think that right now the Russians are also, of course, looking at, as you mentioned, at their new other opportunities. But for the time being, it looks like that the situation is not going to spill over beyond a point unless the Western countries decide to go in once again for the adventurism.
The situation might not spill over is what the ambassador is suggesting. Professor Pant, you know, looking at what has happened in the recent past, looking at the statements that have come out as well over the last couple of days, Vladimir Putin seems to have taken a very strong stand. He is saying that, you know, there could be chaos to world affairs if something more happens in Syria. On the other hand, the US is contemplating sanctions on Russia. Where is all this headed?
Well, I think at the level of great power politics, there is a certain amount of stability that both sides seem to have achieved. If you look at the very calibrated...
So can we safely say that this is just posturing at this moment? It
seems very much like that because ultimately if you look at the kind of strikes that have happened and the very calibrated strikes that have happened, the idea that somehow you know, the Russians and the Americans were on the same page, not on the same page in terms of what should have happened, but at least they were told that this is going to happen. And the kinds of strikes that have happened, the Russians also allowed a certain amount of you know, toning down during that period. So I think at the ground level, what we witnessed was a certain amount of coordination, if you will, between the Americans and the Russians in terms of the war fighting. So the targets, as the Western countries seem to be claiming, are largely 3 targets, which were basically chemical weapons facilities, according to the Western sources. And the idea was that we need to send this message out that chemical weapons use will not go unpunished. So you are raising up the ante of deterrent, of chemical weapons deterrent. So it doesn't serve any other purpose. It doesn't serve the purpose of the Syrian conflict in terms of going forward towards a political mediation, because the ground realities remain the same. The great powers remain where they were before this conflict. If the major, I think, in terms of strategy, Washington is signaling that one day Mr. Trump says we are getting out, the next day he says missiles are coming. So I think at some level it also shows the kind of confusion that pervades, and many would also suspect that perhaps what is happening domestically to Mr. Trump has a bearing on what he's doing in Syria and with these sort of strikes. So I think there are a number of issues as far as the West is concerned that they will have to answer. But I think largely, if you look at the ground reality, I don't see much changing in the short to medium term, because the larger reality of the Syrian conflict 7 years down the line remains where it is. Assad seems to be firmly in place, and the people are suffering.
And it doesn't really impact the big players directly.
Exactly. And I think what it impacts are largely the Syrian people, ordinary Syrians who are suffering every day. But if you look at the major players here, they're all well ensconced in their respective positions.
Indeed. Let me bring in Pramit Chaudhuri into the picture. Now, Pramit, it seems like Trump is trying to deviate all the heat that he's receiving locally and trying to has carried out these strikes. So clearly trying to deflect the pressure that he's facing on the ground in America, back home in America. And that's precisely what's happening, is what the other panelists are suggesting.
I wouldn't agree. I don't think that Trump's base is effectively isolationist. His own supporters support his position, which is that America should pull out of Syria and should not be involved. So if he wants to keep his base happy, what he would be doing is doing exactly what he said he wants to do, which is to get out of Syria and let the Syrians keep fighting with each other. I would argue this is, if there is a domestic policy and agenda in all of this, it has more to do with his battle with the Washington establishment, which keeps hoping or believing that America should remain present in Syria. They have about 2,000 troops supporting the Kurds. And in particular, America should be trying to push back on the two main external players in Syria, Russia and Iran, who are effectively allied together and who dominate Syria right now. And if anything, carrying out the strike, I think, could have been, we may find out about this later, maybe an attempt by the Pentagon and other groups to force Trump to postpone the idea of pulling America out of Syria, which he still hopes to do by this summer, but which people like Mattis and others in his administration are trying to stop him from doing. So I would say if there is a domestic agenda, it's really about trying to force Trump to keep the course, stay the line in Syria. But the result is really an American policy that doesn't accomplish anything, because America cannot get their president to agree to a greater military commitment to Syria. But on the other hand, they can't. The president cannot get his administration to agree to a complete pullout.
Okay. Ambassador, as far as the allies are concerned, we've seen a coming together of the allied forces, that people were saying, the relationship between Trump and Theresa May and of course the French president they were not all on the same page. Everything was not in order. But here it seems to have, it seems like all of them have come together and carried out this attack.
Well, as far as the military dimension is concerned, they have always been together. I mean, any major military excursion, so to say, if you say, interventions, they are always present all together. They coordinate their activities. Of course, Germany refused to participate in it, but she eventually supported these strikes. So when it comes to their NATO or within their own security parameters, they try to do it. But what has happened is now Theresa May also is having a bit domestic problem, as Professor Pant and others mentioned. So she's also going to have a problem in the parliament. I think they were discussing it today.
Yeah, she was questioned on it. Yes.
And how can you take them? And similarly, now the Europeans, the EU foreign policy established, they met and they are now supporting, they are having a conference on Syria in Brussels, where they would like to support the UN process for a political dialogue. This is what everybody has been talking, but nobody has been working towards it. That is the biggest problem. I mean, Geneva process is virtually dead with these kind of strikes. And therefore, I mean, the logical conclusion of these things is that if you are sending the inspectors, you wait for the results to come out. It doesn't come out, and therefore you just create a further mess. But then it was like, as we earlier mentioned, it seemed like a lot of show business, and just to convey to the Russians that we are still there. We cannot be just discounted in the process. The Iranians obviously have been attacked by the Israelis on the other side, and then we are having this kind of a mess. I mean, currently it doesn't look like that they're going to be a major fracas, so the Third World War III or something like that. Although one of the Russian TV channels was talking about that the Russians should be ready with the iodine and all that, and be prepared for a Third World War or something like that, nuclear war. But that is, we are not there as yet. But at the same time, as you know, in the First World War was just triggered by a very silly kind of an issue, and that anything can happen, because see, if any, by chance, if a Russian facility was attacked in the process or was destroyed, then you could have seen there was an immediate response from the Russians. They're ready there. And so now you will see a greater Russian presence in there, and Putin will have to emerge with some kind of an action plan in the region as to how he's going to react, because he cannot continue to remain getting this kind of beating from them.
Sure. Professor Pant, where does this leave the other players? The other big player, of course, is Iran and Assad himself. So where does it leave Iran and Assad?
See, I think there is already a conversation that has moved to an understanding. If you see the Washington, many saner voices in Washington, what they are saying is that the only way you can progress a bit on this in this crisis is by acknowledging the fact that Assad has seemingly won for the time being, that he will be there in power for the time being. Now, because clearly Washington does not really have the capabilities at this point to shape the battleground, if you will. Now, the reality is, of course, that the battleground is very complex. You have the Kurds and the Turks fighting. You have Israelis and the Iranians fighting. You have Syrian government and the opponents fighting on the ground. So it's not as if there is one battleground which can be shaped. And on top of that, you have this big power conflict between the Russians and the Americans for something more than just Syria. It's about shaping the larger Middle Eastern reality. Something that Mr. Trump, for example, acknowledged that, look, we really can't do much about Middle East. It's very ironical. He was sending in these missiles and then saying that, look, we can't do much about the Middle East. They'll have to fight their own battles. And ultimately, he mentioned countries like UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, but they're also fighting amongst themselves. So it's not entirely clear which are the stakeholders who can take this forward. Ultimately, it seems that some sort of reconciliation between America and Russia about the future of this country, which then brings in other actors like Turks and Iranians, is the only way forward. But there is no acknowledgement from either side that is something that they are seriously considering, given the sort of war fighting that is going on now that Americans have shown their cards in terms of what they wanted to do, sending a message after the apparently a chemical attack. So largely, it is very interesting that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, made this statement to the French television, saying that it was he who convinced Mr. Trump that this attack was necessary. So I think some amount of jostling is also happening in Western capitals as to what is the way forward. Can you really shape the battlefield by doing these strikes? Or is it something that you should take as a given that Assad has won for the time being and you move from there? I think unless there is some sort of an acknowledgement on these fronts, it's very unlikely that you can do anything to Mr. Assad, who apparently had a very busy day after the strikes, and he was, we were told by media reports that he was doing his ordinary work with great amount of conviction that he's here to stay. So it looks as if the ground realities are somewhat different from what these missile strikes intend to convey, that the West is also in the business for the time being. Indeed.
Let me bring in A.K.Ramakrishnan, Professor, Center for West Asian Studies, JNU, into the picture now. He joins us on the phone line. Professor Ramakrishnan, as far as what's happening in Syria is concerned in West Asia, do you believe that the fragile status quo is going to continue, at least for the time being?
The status quo itself has been a very chaotic kind of situation for long. And now what's happening is that you have a so-called mission which is undertaken without the goal in mind. The goal, as many people earlier have talked about, should be some political, consultation, negotiations, and then moving forward. Without any of those, goalposts in front, what is going on now is just playing in the muddled waters of the Syrian conflict. But this time the difference is that one of the major NATO allies of the region, Turkey, is not playing with the Europeans and the Americans. And the French role in this is extremely significant, I think, and which was mentioned earlier. But what Macron said was that, it is not only that he has convinced, Trump to do this, but it is that the Americans are there to stay. And you have within a week the American position changing from disengagement to active involvement in that kind of a situation where nothing is foreseen. There's no goal to be achieved.
Professor Ramakrishnan, what seems to have changed the Americans' mind in a span of 1 week? What has prompted this change?
I think it is a lot to do with Russia. Even though, there is some discussion earlier among the other panelists about the domestic compulsions and other things. But I think, because the role of the Russians and the Iranians, particularly the Russians, the kind of pushing out of the European and the American players was a major concern. And this emerges out of a deeper crisis in the sovereignty-based international system that we had until now. You want to remove Assad, but you cannot, because what comes after, nobody knows. And in that kind of a situation, the traditional principles of sovereignty and non-intervention, etc., is removed from Afghanistan onward in the new situation. And in that kind of a political context, it's very difficult to have such interventions achieving any major political goals as such, given the flux of international politics at this time, and given the complexity of the Syrian crisis.
Sure. Let me bring in Pramit Pal Chaudhuri now. Pramit, as far as Syria is concerned, are you worried that it's headed in the same way as Iraq did?
Well, Iraq is actually quite stable now, so I'm not certain why you think Iraq is a good analogy. I think what you're seeing here, quite the opposite. The dominance of Assad, backed by Russia and Iran, is now almost complete in Syria. There is almost no resistance left to him. There's a small Kurdish enclave backed by the Americans, which the Turks have taken on, and they are in a quasi-alliance with Russia, Iran, and Assad. The other rebel enclaves that are left, Assad is slowly taking them out one by one. The Russian and Iranian axis is now overwhelmingly the winner of the war in Syria. We're now really seeing just mopping up operations. It'll take a while. And the Geneva process has been dead for a long time. It's the Astana process, backed by Russia and Iran, which is the only multilateral peace negotiation for Syria that is going on and actually getting anywhere. It's not being very successful, but it's the only one that's actually getting any traction. So Syria is effectively now a Russian-Iranian game in which they have almost all the cards. I would also add that in Iraq, it's Iran which is the dominant external player, is also there. So in an area running from about Lebanon all the way to Iran, it is Tehran backed by Moscow, which is by far the dominant external player. The only country right now that has the ability to shift this game is not the Americans, who have absolutely no interest or have no coherent capacity to intervene. It's Israel. Israel continues to be waiting to see how far Iran is prepared to go against them, because they assume that at some point, when Iran has consolidated its hold over Syria, they will turn on Israel. Israel, far from actually having fought with the Iranians, though some panelists have said so, has in fact kept its powder very dry and has been preparing for what they see as a three-front war with Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran coming in from the Syrian side. That's the real future that we should be looking at, because that's the real battle that will be coming in potentially as early as next year.
Ambassador, do you agree with that? The potential battle, the real issue is going to be between Iran and Israel going forward, and that's what we need to brace ourselves up for.
Well, Israel by itself, as you know, may not go in, but if absolutely it has to be supported by the Western and the NATO allies, with whom they have the power to attack. But at the same time, I think that Israelis will continue to attack, because they have another big hassle on their head, and that is Gaza and the Palestine and other thing, which is also keeping them pretty much occupied. So I think that the Iranians are pretty strong at the moment. I mean, they have Hezbollah to fight themselves, and Hezbollah is a pretty strong army by itself. And I think that, of course, it's a very a predictable kind of a scenario that Israel will come full force. But I doubt very much, unless the Americans give them a shove and they want to go ahead with them. But as you know, that Macron has just said that he's going in May to St. Petersburg to meet Putin. Yesterday, Putin spoke to the Turkish president, who said he's taking no from all four, because they have their own interests there.
Yeah.
And therefore, they're not taking any sides. But Turkey is the major player in the game. So Turkey and Israel also have their problems together, and they have been threatened by them. Today there was an Arab summit. At that, all the Arab countries are decided. I mean, Saudi Arabia, which is the Prince Salman had said something about Jerusalem, that Israel has the right to exist. His father has denied that. He said that we stand by the old policy that they have with Israel with Jerusalem as the capital. So the whole Middle Eastern situation is currently very worrisome. And not only, I mean, it's also worrisome for us.
Yeah, it is indeed.
It has a direct impact on our own security and our own safety.
What's at stake for India, Professor, as far as the whole Middle East and West Asian situation is concerned?
Well, so long as it remains confined to Syria, I think not much. But if the potential exists of expansion, as I think others have pointed out, then clearly there are issues which India will have to think very carefully about. After all, it's oil security, your diaspora, your economy is very closely linked now to the Middle Eastern or West Asian security and political landscape and economic landscape. So I think there are issues there are multiple issues on the table which India will have to consider if this expands.
You know, India has called for restraint as far as the Syrian situation is concerned. You know, they've said that all parties need to act responsibly.
Yes, because I think that's that's clearly in the benefit of everyone if they recognize the challenge. But I think conflicts like these tend to tend to happen only because that restraint is not there. So I doubt very much whether India's calling upon restraint would be heeded. I think you will have major powers looking at their own interests in this game. And as I think others have pointed out, the larger landscape remains very problematic, because you not only are looking at Israel and Iran's rising profile in the Middle East, in West Asia, and as a consequence, this element of insecurity that is creeping into the Arab world. That look, Iran is becoming too powerful, and we need to do something about it. And so a lot of this push that is coming for acting against Iranians is also coming from this relationship that the West has shared with the Arab Gulf states. So I think what we are, Syria therefore becomes a small part of that larger game in the larger Middle East, which if not controlled now, then probably it will escalate in some way, shape or form. It is very likely that Mr. Assad would survive, but I don't think that is going to be the end of the interactions between the various players, because if he survives, there also others have different cards to play, which come into action once you have sorted one element out. So I think you will see multiple iterations of this happening over the next few months and years.
You know, Professor Ramakrishnan, that said, is it going to be a difficult balancing act then for India, because both Israel and Iran are extremely crucial for us?
Yes, it is, and it has always been so with respect to the Gulf region. Now in the whole of the West Asian region, and it's one good thing that our interest towards the Mediterranean there, in Syria especially, and in Lebanon, etc., is not as significant as our interest in the Gulf are concerned, even though these are parties to the conflict in Syria. But yes, that tightrope walk that we have practiced very well over a period of time would help at this juncture as well.
Sure, and let me get a comment in from Pramit Chaudhuri as well, and see if I can get a final word from the ambassador on the program. You know, Pramit, what's the way forward, really?
Well, I think what we're seeing is that there's only one peace process right now that has any credibility, which is the Astana process. But it will be difficult. Russia, while it's powerful on the ground, is diplomatically very weak. But the real issue would be, at some point, if possible, for Russia and the West, and preferably even Russia, Iran, and the West, to end their present larger big-picture disputes at the geopolitical level. However, I don't see that happening anytime soon. As has been mentioned, France is taking the lead on this because America remains, if anything, is increasingly more hostile to Russia and now starting to become more hostile to Iran again. So I don't see that I'm not confident that that's going to happen, in which case, therefore, on the ground in Syria, it will remain a straightforward battle, but one in which Russia and Iran hold most of the cards.
Right. Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
Well, I think that what happened is pretty unfortunate for the international system, which seemed to have undermined the very basic ideas. But if at all there was a proof of the chemical weapon attack, this was definitely deplorable, and then it could have been condemned by the whole world. But at the same time, now seeing as the Russia and US relations, Russia and France, Russia-Germany relations currently are at their lowest. But at the same time, they appear to be somewhat civil as far as the international conflagration is concerned. So they are not looking to conflagrate it beyond a point. And I think that Syria, that has been a bit of a theater at the moment, will probably subside, and we will see some kind of a peace process coming out of it. Let's see how the EU process, which is Brussels, this meeting, how it happens, what happens to the French meeting with Putin. And all these things will eventually bring down once again. But as others have mentioned, I don't see a very quick resolution of the problem.
All right. On that note, then, we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this debate is that Flashpoint Syria is going to continue, at least for the time being. We cannot see a resolution to the problem anytime in the near future. But there is hope. Maybe in times to come, something might change on the ground. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.